Before 2001, the bottom of your TV screen was quiet, still, empty. Then, almost overnight, it wasn't. A thin band of text began moving beneath everything. Headlines sliding by, numbers updating, alerts stacking on alerts. It never stopped. After 9/11, information didn't just come at us, it crawled. The ticker promised urgency, constant awareness, no detail missed. But somewhere along the way, the crawl became permanent, and so did the feeling that we might be missing something. 25 years later, the screen is fuller than ever. Graphics layered on graphics, banners, alerts, hashtags, breaking labels. So here's the question. Did the ticker help us stay informed? Or did it quietly rewire how we watch, how we focus, and how we process the world? This is the story of the crawl, where it started, why it made sense in a moment of national crisis, and whether it ever learned how to stop. Let's play memory. So, Michelle, our episode today centers around television, which you and I clearly love, going back to its origin. And television in and of itself has always sort of had this hold over us, this new format that wasn't radio, that obviously had a visual medium that drew people around it, around Hallmark moments, Sunday night programming. I was born in 1985. My upbringing when it came to news and watching news on TV was really very structured around when news was on. 6 o'clock after dinner in our house. I can remember Dan Rather being on at 6:30 and that being sort of a presence on a nightly basis, watching the nightly news. News was very in a box. These were the stories. This is what was going on. Positive piece at the end, typically. And that was that. So you sometimes went 24 hours, at least I did, in between actually like being aware that the news was on and that family was watching it in my house.
Did you guys have a TV in your kitchen?
We did. Yeah, we had a little black and white small TV in the corner.
I can think of friends and family who did have TVs in their kitchen, which we did not. And I imagine the thing that was on the screen most was the news. We were more of a newspaper house. My dad's more of a newspaper reader and still is, although now I think he mostly reads it on his iPad. But I don't remember the news being on in our house. We didn't have that post-dinner block where the news would come on. And my only little snippets of news-related content as a kid were really just those, like the bumpers and the commercials in between whatever I was watching in the evening. So if I was watching something like The Cosby Show, in between a commercial, they may say like, tonight on the 11 o'clock news.
I'm Hal Fishman. Tonight on News at 10, the Soviet Union says war could break out in the Persian Gulf at any moment. Details on this story and all the news tonight on News at 10, right after the movie.
Contrasting with that, I have these very strong memories of binge watching the news. There are 3 events that really stick out in my head. And I don't know if it's just a coincidence that all 3 of these took place during the summer and the TV was just on more because we weren't on a school schedule, or they were just kind of the 3 biggest events in this period of my life. The first one was July 17th, 1996, the TWA 800 flight over Long Island.
The U.S. Coast Guard confirms the plane has crashed on takeoff from John F. Kennedy International Airport tonight. It's reported to be a TWA 747 bound for Paris, France.
For the new listeners, Steve and I both grew up in New York metro area, so I don't know if globally this was a big story, but I remember this being huge in our area, and because it took off from JFK and there were students aboard, it just kind of being one of those first big catastrophes that I was able to really understand and was glued to that footage.
I remember that so well. I was 10 going on 11, able to understand what had happened. We also used to go on vacation every summer to Long Island out to East Hampton the last week of July, first week of August that we would go on there. So it was very fresh and conversations that I remember the adults talking on the beach and just the somberness of it all. So yeah, very much remember TWA Flight 800 and when it crashed.
Okay, so I had to do a double take on this because I always get these two events, not that I get them mixed up, but I definitely group them together. And the second one, and this definitely had more news footage, I know, globally, and that was the JFK Jr. plane crash, which happened on July 16th in 1999. When the plane initially crashed, it was, I mean, essentially the story that I remember hearing as a kid is like, the plane disappeared and they don't know where they are. Like it wasn't definite that they knew that they had passed away, and there was this whole search.
The first report from the Coast Guard is that a blip was last seen just miles west of Martha's Vineyard. A second separate report is that that the plane was last heard from at 9:39 p.m. and the timing of that would suggest that it was up in the Martha's Vineyard area.
No matter what channel you went to, you were essentially seeing the same thing.
It is always interesting, though, as an aside, because obviously you don't know what happened, but it's like when they say the plane went missing, you're just like, where did it go? Like, there's always this like, I feel like we're putting off the inevitable here, but yeah, I think that's also the drama and the anxiety around these news broadcasts where it's like, you're hanging on to this hope that things are going to turn out okay. But yeah, I do remember that one as well.
Okay. And then my last one, I'm going a little bit out of chronological order here, but it was when Princess Diana died, August 31st, 1997. And I don't know if I've talked about this on any of our shows before, but this one was also significant because this was right around the time where I had the first significant loss in my life. Is when my grandma passed away. It was like days before this. So I think my family was already, in this state of grief. And then to have this big thing happen in the world.
We have all evening long been covering an unfolding story that took a very, very tragic turn with confirmation from Buckingham Palace tonight that the world has lost Princess Diana at age 36.
The coverage that went on from everything from, the tragedy of her death through the funeral and then the aftermath of that. I mean, that I felt like the news really milked that situation.
Yeah, I think that's a great way of putting it. I remember that because it was right around Labor Day, and it was also a few days before school. We went back to school in September. So it's one of those like weird times where you're just sort of in like a holding pattern as a kid around that time of year, right? It's the last couple of days of summer. And I just remember that feeling like a very transitional time in my life. And also with the coverage and the grief and the sorrow of everything that took place, how it happened. I just remember that time period being very still and depressing.
The timing of it with it happening at the end of the summer, when you have to go back to school, you're already feeling like, okay, like the fun is done. It's time to like be serious and get back to work. And then to have this really big, tragic event happen right around that time is also this kind of like a little bit of a loss of innocence for us at these very formative ages that we were at this time, and facing the realities of the world. And I think that that's something that was very much echoed in an even bigger way when it came to the events that I don't think that there was a single person who was not watching the news on repeat during this era, and that was when 9/11 happened.
News was designed, I think, in a very traditional way. There might have been some advancements, but it felt pretty similar. Broadcasts traditionally used lower thirds for identification on the screen, so you knew who was talking or who was being featured. There would be occasional, breaking news banners. I think as we kind of got into the late 90s, I think that became more commonplace. And then there would have traditional cut-ins. You could remember watching a show on, NBC, ABC, CBS, whatever it might be. And then all of a sudden there was that like hard cut. And then it was.
This is an ABC News special report.
And then it was this really dramatic, urgent music. I still have like PTSD over like the NBC News breaking news update music. It's still, if I heard it today, would give me a little bit of like a who died reaction. You know, it's like when you get that phone call from your parent in the middle of the day and you're like, this isn't good, whatever this is going to be. But for the most part, it felt like the screen that we were watching was mostly sacred. There was always one focal point, the newscaster behind the desk throwing to the reporter in the field, but your attention was largely placed on that one person. But there were like early exceptions. After my dad retired, he got very into the stock market. So I can remember coming home from school and like having like CNBC on, and of course like on the bottom of the screen is the ticker of like stock updates and things like that. I think ESPN used to do updates twice an hour. I remember it used to be 28 and 58 after the hour, where like, you know, the bottom line would come up, they'd give you some score updates, and then it would go back down. I felt like viewers really accepted tickers in these niche contents, sports, you know, updates, stock situations, but we really didn't see that widespread.
Well, it was a lot more purposeful. Talking about ESPN, for that to come up twice an hour, it was probably just the right amount. But in today's, like my 2026 brain, I just imagine it being a permanent fixture. And I have forgotten that it was ever different than that. So we will fast forward to 9/11. I already kind of alluded to this, but for our generation so far, this is kind of like the defining news event of our lifetime, and also another loss of innocence. And like, okay, this is like a real scary thing that's happening in our world. And I think that there's a reason that we were all glued to the news. I mean, not just that day, but in the aftermath as well. What are the reasons that this happens, that, you know, the crawl became a permanent fixture and that all of these other things got added to it? And comparing it to the ESPN, like the scores, like, okay, it would be nice to know what the scores are all the time, but we're fine just hearing about it twice an hour. Whereas when we're in this international and national crisis, there was so much changing by the minute. There was so much information to communicate. We were, as humanity, like peak fear and wanting answers and wanting reassurance that we're going to be okay. And this all kind of imploded from a media standpoint. Also remembering that we didn't have social media then, we didn't have Twitter. A lot of people didn't even have computers. So the news was still the only place that people could depend on to go to get all of these answers that we were looking for, which led to, yes, we're going to put this news ticker that's going to be a permanent fixture on your screen no matter what.
What lies ahead for our country?
We're at war. There's been an act of war declared upon America by terrorists, and we will respond accordingly.
This morning, we'll bring you the latest from America's leaders.
They were breaking evolving stories, multiple stories that were happening. The airline statuses, as we remember right after 9/11, they were like, they grounded all the planes, so people were stuck places. Then we had the statements from the government, and then we had emergency instructions. My head is spinning just remembering all of this. Again, just being at these really formative ages. You were at the end of high school, and I was in my first year of college, and the chaos that I was already feeling in my life at that time, away from home for the first time in my life, and in the first weeks, this happens.
Yeah, I think it's still pretty triggering for me all these years later. I still have a very hard time talking about that day and what it felt like. There was nothing that prepared us. It's possible that older generations, you know, that might have gone through Pearl Harbor or remember things that occurred in the past might have had some level of a basis, but you know, for us was something that we really didn't have a reference point on. So everything was in the moment, in front of us, uncharted, and we were sort of navigating it minute to minute, especially in those early hours once the attack occurred. We started to see the development of the news ticker and the way that news was presenting this information, because there was demand for this. People needed to be updated, and really what you were showing on screen at the time, which was live shots or absolute horror of people walking through streets and disoriented, and we're all well familiar with those images and that footage by now. But there was also a need to communicate up to the minute updates on things. People didn't know where people were. People didn't know what the status of certain things were. So it fit in the moment. If you're talking about effective crisis communication, regular updates on things do tend to put people at some level of ease. It doesn't erase everything, but at least it makes it predictable. That crawl really kind of created the feeling of constant information flow. And it communicated that there was, in general, that there was more happening than the news could fit in the frame. Much like the breaking news jingles that we were, kind of laughing at earlier, it was designed to reduce uncertainty, but because of its appearance, because of it being different, because of it being constant, it signaled an urgency just in its presence alone, even though it was probably there to reduce that uncertainty and that need for news. So the psychological push-pull of it is, I think, something worth sort of debating. Where do you fall on the spectrum of reducing uncertainty being the intention of it versus was its presence alone there to just signal the urgency of the situation? Or is it both?
I think it's both. They had too many things to communicate too quickly. And I do ultimately think that the nature of the way that they were communicating with all of this stuff flying at us and things like flashing and like news breaks and, like you said, essentially like that jingle that still rattles us today. It was just like constant beats of that when you were watching TV, but yet we couldn't look away because we were all looking for answers. But I do think that the consumption of that made us more anxious, I think, than it calmed us.
As we got further away from 9/11, the crawl was something that stayed as a part of as news features because it shifted from crisis communications updates. If you go to YouTube and you can pull up news broadcasts from those days afterwards and you're reading what's down there, it is some pretty heavy information, anthrax and this and that. Like, it's some heavy stuff. And now you're starting to see, as we kind of got out of into 2002, beyond 2002, as we started to phase away a little bit from those days of 9/11, headlines read very differently. There were weather updates, there were different political updates, there were teases for like upcoming segments. And it's one of those things where it's like, if some is good, I think they felt more was better. This is where I feel like we started to shift from presenting information with the intention of informing people to having more of a focus on viewer retention, holding people, making programming feel urgent even when it's not. And I think it put us on a path to where we start to see, and now in 2026, we just have this information overload everywhere. And I kind of believe that this was where it started.
I don't want to make this analogy because I don't want to make 9/11 sound like a party, but it's almost like if you were hosting an event at your house, you might bring in extra furniture, you might cater food, you may decorate, but then when the event is over and everyone goes home, then you take those things away and you go back to how your house looked before that. And if we're saying that the news was a house, they kept all the decorations up. They did not take them down. And not only that, but because we even early on, I think, started to get a little immune to them, to the news flash or the crawl at the bottom. They felt like they had to step it up. They made the crawls more stylized and experimenting with different fonts and having things that are bolder. And the breaking news banners, they became more semi-permanent, which is redundant. I mean, to say that it's breaking news, but it's also like permanently there makes no sense. The graphics grew louder, and I think we just started to see more things on the screen. It wasn't just enough to have the crawl at the bottom or to have the breaking news kind of like burst graphic. But then we started to slowly see these little extra graphics become permanent fixtures on our TV screens, where we're used to just seeing. I'm thinking back to the very beginning of news broadcasts where it was just a person communicating what was happening.
Right.
And now fast forward to post 9/11, the early 2000s, and what the screen evolved into, and then thinking about where we are now.
I remember watching Pardon the Interruption when it first debuted on ESPN. They had the topics in graphic form running down the side of the screen from top to bottom, so you knew what they were talking about next. Everything was kind of framed. I remember my dad being in the room with me and saying, because the bell had rung, because the time was up on the topic and they were moving on to the next topic. And I remember him asking, like, what is this? And I was like, oh, well, these are the topics that they're talking about. And they just kind of have the rundown over there. And even after 9/11, it felt normal at that time to me that, like, yeah, this makes sense. They have this there, so I know what's coming up again. Graphical elements added to the screen with the design to hold the viewer, because if the third topic is something that really pertains to you or that you're interested in, you're going to sit around and watch the first couple of things so you can get to that topic. And I think, like, the crawl and these graphics, they started to change the way we focused when we were consuming content, right? You know, the crawl in and of itself, it requires your brain to be dual processing information, right? You're listening to the anchor, the voice on screen, and you're also reading the moving text that's going beneath it. So there are studies in cognitive psychology that really show that moving text at the bottom of a screen increases cognitive load, and the viewers end up retaining less from spoken information when they're reading something and they're listening, because the brain can really only, I mean, it's like when somebody says I'm a great multitasker, and it's like, no, you're not. Like, that's not a thing. Like, but you're really only able to retain what you're reading and less from the spoken word. So in and of itself, this thing that was designed to hold people, which it still might have been doing, that became the dominant result. But what it wasn't doing was helping the audience to retain the important information that was being put out there, because you were already split in two different ways. It almost kind of mirrored early browsing on the internet, like that behavior of going here, going there, going this, going that. Like, you really weren't centrally focused in on any one thing. And we became sort of trained, I guess, by these media outlets to scan constantly, your eyes having to scan where things are on the screen constantly versus your attention just being in one area. And those conditions kind of position viewers to expect this simultaneous stream of information, and almost launch this overload of content consumption that we kind of experience now and are almost kind of fighting against now. So I guess the question ahead of this for me is, this reality that we face now, do we feel like it was launched by the news crawl? Did it anticipate the smartphone era? And did it accelerate our fragmented attention culture?
I don't know that it could have anticipated it, but I certainly think that it helped shape it. The internet was almost inspired by the way that the news communicated and the way that it visually shares its information. While they may have had the best intentions in kind of in the beginning of this, I don't know that having more information all at once is more effective.
I felt aware, even in, the months after 9/11, that my attention was focusing in on one part of the screen while there was something else going on the screen. It felt like my brain was being pulled, and training of the brain to set itself up for this smartphone era where we are on information overload because of what's being pushed through us through social media, being pushed through through app notifications, where sounds and haptics end up diverting our attention to something else. I do think the seeds of that came. They realized it could be used. Media companies realized, hey, this could be used for something else. And I think the unintended, I hope, consequences of that is sort of what we have evolved into as a consumption society.
In 2001, it felt necessary, but in 2026, this is our default.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of putting it. So I guess, has it lost its relevancy to you? Has the crawl lost its relevancy?
I think that we've gotten to this scary point where it's not just that it has lost its relevancy. I think we're starting to not, I know we're having this whole discussion about it, so we're obviously aware of it. But I think that day to day and moment to moment, we're not even aware anymore that our attention is being split because we've gotten so used to doing it.
I used to have a joke, I still do, with a buddy of mine where, you talk about texting and driving, and everyone's always, oh, you can't text and drive. You shouldn't text and drive. And I want to be really clear. You should not text and drive. But I said to him, I go, but doesn't it stand to reason that as a society, we would just get better at this? Like, it would be like a muscle that it just becomes more and more like we can do this. Like, we can do hard things. To me, that's what this feels like. We have been so trained and our brains have been so split because of technology, because of impulse and whatnot, that we're not even aware of it anymore. We've just become that good at it, I guess, or bad at it, depending upon how you look at it. So I agree. I think it has lost its relevancy, but I think it has lost its relevancy because it has been replaced. That crawl is still there if you go into the 24-hour news channels that are on regular television still, but where we seem to get our updates from, or how we get our information, has changed in the last quarter century, right? We're getting it on our phones, social media. I think younger audiences ignore cable news entirely. I don't really think that is something that pulls them the way we might have been in that boat, because it's the only thing that existed at that point in time.
The way that graphics are integrated with our screens and splitting everything and splitting it and splitting it and splitting it. Do you think that that's ever going to go away, or do you think it's going to get worse?
I don't think it's going to go away. It goes back to something we said earlier. I think news companies look at this as if some is good, more must be better. They're doing what they can to retain audiences. So whether that's through traditional engagement, non-traditional engagement with panels and scan this code and whatever, I feel like those are things that are continuing to clutter up the screen. I don't think we ever go backwards as a society with the way things were. I think we long for a simpler time or a simpler presentation, or the way news might have been presented, or it feels like the days of watching the nightly news. I would love to do that again, but I also know that the way it's presented, the angle of it, the political nature around all of it, it's not possible. So I only feel like we are just always upping the ante, these enhancements, quote unquote.
I have to admit, I feel a little complicit in it because we both kind of tangentially work in media, or we create things that we share online, including this. And the wheels are already spinning in my brain as I'm thinking about how we're going to present this story and share it on YouTube. And every expert kind of tells you that the way that our brains work now is that we can't just have the two of us talking. If you go back and look at our earliest iterations of our old podcast, I mean, that's all it was just kind of like just the two of us on a split screen. And now I recognize that that's not, I say it's not good enough, but it's not going to be received in a 2026 viewer. Like, we need to have multiple things going on at once, depending on the medium. If you think about when you pause your screen now when you're watching something on streaming, it's an ad, it's a barcode, it's a click here. Like there's so much, but we can't. This is what we have to do now.
Yeah. And I also think it's what we have to do because we have just as a consumption audience have become so programmed to expect it. Like I think about the advent of audio in our society and the rise that it had with the early days of podcasting. And I can always remember saying making the case for it, why I liked podcasts. It was because it was the only thing on my phone where I could be doing multiple things. I even think about like sleep habits that I have now. And I'm not blaming anybody. This is me. But I fall asleep most nights listening to a podcast. And I can't think about two differing things that my body needs that are actively working against each other. I'm exhausted, but I really want to finish this last podcast on Roald Dahl that I've been really involved in for the last couple of weeks.
I think everyone in our generation has become aware that this is happening, but I'm even just thinking back to this last week and just starting to notice like how bad it's gotten. Even, I mean, I know you do this too, Steve, but like anytime you have like a moment of like a lull, let's say I'm trying to transfer a file and I see that it's going to take 3 seconds. I'm not waiting 3 seconds and watching that process. I'm picking up my phone or I'm clicking on something else on my screen and my brain is getting involved in something else. And I think now, but it's also gotten to the point where it's not just a one thing that's happening and that I need to find a diversion during that lull, but it's almost becoming so bad that I mean, I rarely watch TV and just watch TV. I mean, it's like, okay, what else am I going to watch TV and like, do the crossword puzzle, or am I going to watch TV and like do the crossword puzzle and text and look at social media? Not to like hammer this point home, but what's happening on all of those planes also have multiple things happening within them.
And
this
it's
is
all
not good.
But I think the creators of those things around you are, better or worse, are intentionally designing that, knowing that what you just explained happens. They're creating it knowing that this is going to happen this way. It doesn't seem to be slowing down at all. And the only thing that's going to allow for that is for us to be able to walk away from this. And I don't know if that's ever going to be the case. I think it's just multiplied.
This feels like a sad conclusion. Do we have any hope?